Welcome, history lovers, to the first chapter of our journey into the American story. Today, we're turning back the clock to the year 1800, a time when the United States was a mere toddler on the world stage. Picture this: a nation of just 16 states hugging the Atlantic coast, with a population smaller than modern-day New York City. The vast majority of its 5 million people were farmers, their lives dictated by the rising and setting of the sun and the rhythm of the seasons. Cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston were bustling. Yes, but they were islands of urbanity in a sea of agriculture. The nation's capital was still a muddy, unfinished construction site, a far cry from the Washington, D.C. we know today. This young republic was a grand experiment in democracy, led by figures who would become legends. Men like Thomas Jefferson, who was about to win a contentious presidential election, but the nation's future was far from certain. To the north, the British still loomed in Canada. To the south and west, the mighty Spanish Empire controlled Florida and a vast territory stretching across the continent. And nestled between the Appalachian Mountains and the mighty Mississippi River were the lands of numerous Native American nations who had called this continent home for centuries. The United States was a country full of ambition and youthful energy, but it was also surrounded by powerful neighbors and grappling with its own internal divisions. The true frontier, the line between the known and the unknown, was the Mississippi River. For the American farmer, this river was a lifeline. It was the highway they used to float their crops, their corn, wheat, and tobacco, down to the bustling port of New York. From there, their goods would be loaded onto ocean-going ships and sent to markets on the East Coast and across the Atlantic. The entire economy of the American West depended on this single, vital artery. Control of New Orleans meant control of the continent's interior, and in 1800, that control belonged to Spain. This single geographic fact created a constant source of tension and anxiety for the young United States. But the world was in flux. Across the ocean, Europe was embroiled in the Napoleonic Wars. A brilliant and ruthlessly ambitious general, Napoleon Bonaparte, had seized power in France. His grand vision for a new French empire was about to send shockwaves across the globe, and these ripples would reach the shores of the distant American Republic in ways no one could have predicted. Unbeknownst to the American farmer floating his flatboat down the Ohio River, a secret deal was being struck in Europe. In 1800, Spain secretly agreed to return the vast Louisiana territory, including the crucial port of New Orleans, to France. Suddenly, the strategic situation for the United States became infinitely more precarious. Spain was a declining power, a manageable neighbor. France, under Napoleon, was the most aggressive and powerful military force in the world. The thought of a French army landing in New Orleans, of Napoleon's empire taking root on America's doorstep, sent a chill down the spine of President Jefferson and his administration. He famously wrote that the day France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. The potential closure of the Mississippi River to American trade wasn't just an economic inconvenience. It was an existential threat. It could strangle the nation's westward expansion and potentially tear the young country apart. This was the crisis that defined the dawn of the 19th century for the United States. It was a nation of immense potential, with a population hungry for land and opportunity. The gaze of the country was fixed westward, beyond the Appalachian Mountains, towards the fertile plains that promised a prosperous future. But this future was now held hostage by the ambitions of a European emperor. The United States was at a crossroads. It was too weak to challenge Napoleon's France militarily, yet too ambitious to accept having its destiny dictated from across an ocean. The growing pains of this young nation were becoming acute. Jefferson knew he had to act. Diplomacy was his only real weapon. He dispatched his trusted envoy, James Monroe, to Paris with a critical mission. Monroe was to join the American minister, Robert Livingston, and attempt to purchase New Orleans and the Florida territories from France. Their initial budget was a modest $10 million. They went to Paris, not with demands, but with a plea, hoping to secure the nation's economic future and remove the threat of a powerful European empire from their backyard. They had no idea that they were walking into one of the most astonishing geopolitical bargains in history. The stage was set for a diplomatic showdown that would not only solve the crisis on the Mississippi, but would dramatically and unexpectedly reshape the entire North American continent. What was happening in Napoleon's mind? Why would he, after going to the trouble of reacquiring this vast territory, even consider selling it? The answer lay thousands of miles away, on the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. Napoleon had envisioned the Louisiana Territory as the breadbasket for France's lucrative sugar colonies in the Caribbean. But his plans were shattered by a massive and successful slave rebellion led by the brilliant Toussaint Louverture. The French army sent to crush the revolt was decimated by yellow fever and fierce resistance. Without the wealth-generating engine of Saint-Domingue, the strategic value of Louisiana plummeted in Napoleon's eyes. Furthermore, war with Great Britain was once again on the horizon. Napoleon needed money, and he needed it fast, to fund his European conquests. He also knew that the vast, remote territory of Louisiana would be nearly impossible to defend. From the powerful British Navy, it was more of a liability than an asset. He realized it was better to sell it to the Americans, a neutral and friendly power, than to lose it for nothing to his British enemies. It was a classic Napoleonic move, decisive, pragmatic, and utterly surprising. He decided to cut his losses and get what he could for the territory, shocking his own ministers with the suddenness of his decision. So when the American diplomats, Monroe and Livingston, made their timid offer for just New Orleans, they were stunned by the response from Napoleon's finance minister. "What will you give for the whole of Louisiana?" he asked. "The entire territory, from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains." The Americans were floored. They had no authority, no instructions from President Jefferson to make such a monumental purchase. There was no time to send a letter across the Atlantic and wait months for a reply. They had to make a decision on the spot. It was a breathtaking gamble. Seizing the opportunity of a lifetime, they went far beyond their mandate. After a few days of tense negotiation, agreed to a price, $15 million, for roughly 828,000 square miles of land. The news of the Louisiana Purchase landed in America like a thunderbolt. Jefferson was both thrilled and conflicted. He had dreamed of an empire of liberty, a vast agrarian republic, and this purchase made that dream a reality. Overnight, the United States had doubled in size. The threat on the western border was eliminated, and the path for expansion was wide open. But there was a problem. Jefferson was a strict constructionist, meaning he believed the federal government could only do what was explicitly written in the Constitution. And the Constitution said nothing about the president having the power to purchase foreign territory. He was torn between his political philosophy and this incredible, nation-altering opportunity. In the end, pragmatism won. Jefferson swallowed his constitutional doubts, arguing that the unique circumstances justified the action. He urged Congress to approve the treaty, and they did. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 stands as arguably the most significant event in the early history of the United States. For a price of about 3 cents an acre, the nation acquired a territory that would eventually be carved into 15 new states. It secured the future of the Republic, fueled a century of westward expansion, and set the United States on the path to becoming a continental power. The growing pains of 1800 had given way to a massive growth spurt, one that would define the nation's character and its destiny for generations to come. Thank you so much for joining us for this first chapter. We've seen a young nation face a crisis and emerge stronger and vastly larger. If you enjoyed this deep dive into American history, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back, history lovers. Today, we're rediving deep into the mind of one of America's most fascinating and complex founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. We're moving into Chapter 2 of our series, Jefferson's Vision for Expansion. So, grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's journey back to the very beginning of the 19th century. Picture this. It's 1801. The United States is a young, scrappy nation, mostly clustered along the Atlantic coast. The vast, mysterious lands west of the Appalachian Mountains are a frontier of forests, rivers, and the unknown. In the brand new capital of Washington, D.C., a new president takes the oath of office. This isn't just any president. It's Thomas Jefferson, a man of science, philosophy, and immense contradictions. And he has a dream, a colossal, continent-spanning dream. Jefferson didn't just see America as a collection of 13 states. He envisioned something much, much grander. He called it an empire of liberty. Now, that phrase might sound a bit odd to our modern ears. Empire and liberty seem like opposites, right? But for Jefferson, they were two sides of the same coin. He believed that for a republic to survive, to truly flourish, it needed space. Lots and lots of space. Why? Because at the heart of Jefferson's vision was the yeoman farmer. He idealized the small, independent landowner who tilled his own soil, provided for his own family, and answered to no one but himself. He saw these farmers as the bedrock of democracy. In his mind, people who were economically independent could think for themselves, vote with their conscience, and resist the corruption that he believed plagued the crowded, industrial cities of Europe. Jefferson was deeply suspicious of big cities, large-scale manufacturing, and the kind of financial systems championed by his political rival, Alexander Hamilton. He saw urban life as a breeding ground for poverty, dependence, and social unrest. He wrote, "The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government, as soars due to the strength of the human body." A bit harsh, but it shows you just how passionately he felt about this. For Jefferson, the antidote to urban decay was the open land of the American West. So, his grand plan was simple but audacious. America must expand westward. He wanted to fill the continent with these self-sufficient farmers, each with their own plot of land. This ever-expanding agrarian society would, in his view, ensure that American liberty would be preserved for generations. Each new farm was like another brick in the foundation of his empire of liberty. This wasn't just a passive wish. It was an active policy goal. Jefferson saw the vast territories held by European powers France, Spain, Great Britain not as permanent borders, but as temporary obstacles. He believed it was America's destiny to eventually possess these lands. He felt that the American system of government was so virtuous, so superior, that its expansion was a natural and positive development for the world. Think about the scale of this ambition. He wasn't just thinking about the Ohio Valley or the Mississippi River. He was looking all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He imagined a continent populated by free, educated citizens, all living under the banner of a Republican government. It was a vision that was both incredibly optimistic and, as we'll see, fraught with challenges and moral compromises. This idea of an agrarian utopia was deeply rooted in the Enlightenment philosophies that Jefferson so admired. It was about creating a society based on reason, natural law, and individual freedom. He believed that by owning land, a person gained a stake in society. They became a citizen in the truest sense of the word, not just a subject. This ownership would foster virtue, responsibility, and a commitment to the common good. But let's be clear, this vision wasn't without its blind spots. Jefferson's empire of liberty was primarily an empire for white men. While he spoke eloquently about freedom, his vision largely excluded Native Americans, whose lands would be required for this expansion. And it was built on the labor of enslaved African Americans on his own plantation and across the South. These are deep, painful contradictions that we'll explore in more detail later in our series, because you can't understand Jefferson without grappling with them. For now, though, it's crucial to grasp the power of this initial dream. It was this vision of a vast, agrarian republic that drove Jefferson's actions as president. It shaped his foreign policy, his domestic agenda, and it would lead directly to one of the most transformative events in American history. Imagine Jefferson, late at night in the White House, poring over maps of the North American continent. He wasn't just seeing rivers and mountains. He was seeing future farms, future towns, and future states. He was sketching out the future of a nation. He believed that the very soul of America depended on its ability to grow. Stagnation, in his view, would lead to the same old European story of corruption, inequality, and tyranny. Expansion was the key to a new and better future. This wasn't just political theory. It was a deeply personal belief. Jefferson himself was a farmer, a planter. He loved the land, science, and agriculture. He was constantly experimenting with new crops and farming techniques at Monticello. His political philosophy was a direct extension of his personal passions. He wanted to create an entire nation of people like himself, curious, independent, and tied to the soil. This sets the stage for everything that comes next. As Jefferson begins his presidency, the political map of North America is a powder keg. Spain holds the vast Louisiana territory, including the vital port of New Orleans. But across the Atlantic, a new power is rising, Napoleon Bonaparte and his resurgent French Empire. The fate of the continent hangs in the balance. And at the center of it all is President Thomas Jefferson, armed with his powerful and revolutionary vision for an American future. This dream of an empire of liberty is the engine that will drive the story forward. It will lead to daring diplomacy, secret negotiations, and an epic journey of exploration into the unknown. It is a vision that would fundamentally reshape the United States and define its character for centuries to come. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Jefferson's vision. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle to understanding American expansion. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Because in our next chapter, we're going to talk about the single greatest land deal in history. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Louisiana Purchase. Last time, we explored the complex web of treaties and secret deals that saw Louisiana pass from French to Spanish hands. But history, as we know, is never static. The winds of change were blowing across Europe, and a new, formidable figure was rising to power in France. Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, in Chapter 3, we dive into the moment France returned to America, and how this seismic shift sent shockwaves all the way to Washington. So, let's set the scene. It's the turn of the 19th century. Napoleon, a man of immense ambition and military genius, has his eyes set on rebuilding a grand French empire in the Americas. The crown jewel of this vision, the vast, untamed territory of Louisiana. He saw it not just as land, but as a breadbasket, a vital resource to feed and supply his valuable sugar colonies in the Caribbean, particularly the wealthy island of Saint Domingue, what we now know as Haiti. Without a steady flow of grain, timber, and supplies from a nearby North American base, his Caribbean dream was vulnerable. Spain, which had been holding on to Louisiana for nearly 4 decades, was frankly finding it to be more trouble than it was worth. The territory was massive, difficult to govern, and expensive to defend. For the Spanish crown, it was a financial drain and a constant administrative headache. They were struggling to populate it, and were always on edge about the westward expansion of the increasingly boisterous United States. Here's where Napoleon's cunning diplomacy comes into play. He saw an opportunity. He approached Spain's King Charles IV with a deal that seemed, on the surface, too good to refuse. In exchange for the immense Louisiana territory, Napoleon offered a small kingdom in Italy, the Kingdom of Etruria, for the king's son. It was a classic Napoleon move, trading a distant, unwieldy, colonial possession for a prestigious European title and territory. In a secret agreement, the Third Treaty of San Ildefonso, signed in October of 1800, the deal was struck. Spain agreed to transfer Louisiana back to France. The key word here is secret. For a while, the Spanish flag continued to fly over New Orleans, and Spanish officials remained in charge. They were essentially caretakers, waiting for the French to formally take possession. This secrecy was crucial. Napoleon didn't want to alarm the British, his primary rivals, or the Americans, who he knew would be deeply concerned. But secrets like this rarely stay secret for long. Whispers and rumors began to trickle across the Atlantic. By 1801, President Thomas Jefferson and his administration in Washington started hearing unsettling reports. The idea of Spain, a relatively weak and declining power, controlling the mouth of the Mississippi was one thing. The Americans had learned to live with it, even negotiating the right of deposit in New Orleans. This right was absolutely essential for American farmers in the West, in places like Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Their entire livelihood depended on being able to float their goods down the Mississippi and ship them out to the East Coast and Europe from the port of New Orleans. Without that access, their crops and products were virtually worthless. But the thought of Napoleon Bonaparte, the most powerful and aggressive military leader in Europe, controlling that same vital port, that was a completely different and terrifying prospect. Jefferson knew that a French Louisiana was a dagger pointed at the heart of the American interior. He famously wrote that the day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. Think about that for a moment. Jefferson, a notorious Francophile who had always favored France over Britain, was now so alarmed that he was willing to consider an alliance with his nation's former colonial ruler. That shows you the level of anxiety gripping Washington. The fear was palpable. Would Napoleon honor the existing treaties that gave Americans access to the Mississippi, or would he slam the door shut, effectively strangling the American West and halting the nation's expansion in its tracks? A powerful, expansionist France as a next-door neighbor was a nightmare scenario. It could lead to constant friction, border disputes, and potentially even war. The fragile young republic, which had fought so hard for its independence, was suddenly facing a major foreign policy crisis on its very own doorstep. This anxiety reached a boiling point in 1802. The Spanish officials still in charge at New Orleans, acting on orders that were likely influenced by the impending French takeover, suddenly revoked the American right of deposit. Just like that, the port was closed to American commerce. All along the western frontier, outrage erupted. Farmers and merchants were ruined. Calls for action, even for a military invasion of New Orleans, echoed through the halls of Congress. The situation was explosive. Jefferson, a man who preferred peace and diplomacy, found himself backed into a corner. The future of American expansion, the economic stability of the western states, and perhaps the very integrity of the Union were at stake. He knew he had to act, and act decisively. He needed to find a way to secure American access to the Mississippi permanently. This crisis, sparked by Napoleon's secret deal to reclaim Louisiana, became the catalyst for one of the most unexpected and transformative events in American history. It set the stage for a diplomatic mission to Paris, a mission with a modest goal that would ultimately result in a deal beyond anyone's wildest imagination. And that is exactly where we'll pick up next time. How did Jefferson respond to this crisis? Who did he send to negotiate with the formidable Napoleon? Join us for Chapter 4 as we explore the desperate diplomatic gamble that would change the map of America forever. Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying this journey through history, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. We'll see you then. Welcome, bike history buffs. We're diving into Chapter 4 of our journey through American history. And today, we're talking about a true giant, the Mississippi River. Now, I know what you might be thinking. It's just a river, right? Wrong. The Mississippi was, and in many ways still is, the lifeblood of the nation, an absolute lifeline for trade, transport, and sheer survival. Imagine for a moment an America without highways, without railways, without cargo planes. How do you move goods? How do you connect a sprawling, young country? You used the natural highways God gave you, and the Mississippi was the superhighway, from the northern forests all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This river was the main artery. Let's start with trade. Think about the farmers in the Ohio Valley, in places like Kentucky and Tennessee. They were growing massive amounts of corn, wheat, and tobacco, and raising livestock. But here is the problem: getting those goods over the rugged Appalachian Mountains to the markets on the East Coast was incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. It was almost impossible. So, what was their solution? The river. They would load their produce onto flatboats, simple, often one-way vessels, and floated down the Ohio River until it met the mighty Mississippi. From there, it was a long but relatively straightforward journey south to the bustling port of New Orleans. Once in New Orleans, those goods could be sold locally or, more importantly, loaded onto ocean-going ships and sent to the East Coast or even across the Atlantic to Europe. The Mississippi turned the isolated interior of the continent into a commercially viable region. Without it, the westward expansion we know would have been strangled in its crib. This access was so critical that the desire to secure the port of New Orleans was a primary driver behind one of the most incredible real estate deals in history: the Louisiana Purchase. When Spain, which controlled New Orleans, briefly closed the port to American goods in the late 1790s, it caused an economic panic. It showed just how dependent the young United States was on this single waterway. Thomas Jefferson knew he had to secure it, and that's exactly what he did. But it wasn't just about selling things. It was also about getting things. The settlers pushing west needed supplies. Tools, salt, textiles, manufactured goods. While flatboats were great for going downstream with the current, getting back upriver was a different story. For decades, it was a grueling process. Keelboats had to be pulled, rowed, or even pulled by hand from the riverbanks. It could take months to travel a distance that took weeks to float down. The journey was so arduous that many flatboat crews would simply sell their boat for scrap in New Orleans and walk the hundreds of miles, home along trails like the Natchez Trace. This all changed with one of the most important inventions of the 19th century, the steamboat. In 1811, the New Orleans became the first steamboat to navigate the Mississippi. Suddenly, the river became a two-way street. Steamboats could churn their way upstream against the powerful current, dramatically cutting travel time and cost. What once took 4 months could now be done in about 25 days. This revolutionized everything. Towns and cities along the Mississippi and its tributaries exploded in size and importance. St. Louis, Memphis, Vicksburg, Natchez. These weren't just random dots on a map. They were vital hubs of commerce and culture, all thanks to the river at their doorstep. The iconic multi-deck steamboats became floating palaces, transporting not just cotton and sugar, but people and ideas. They carried passengers, mail, news, and entertainment, connecting the isolated communities of the frontier with the rest of the world. Mark Twain, who worked as a steamboat pilot, captured the romance and the danger of this era perfectly in his books. The river was a source of livelihood, a place of adventure, and a character in itself. Beyond trade and transport, the Mississippi was fundamental for survival. The river and its vast floodplain created incredibly fertile land, the famous Mississippi Delta. This rich soil was perfect for growing cash crops, particularly cotton and sugar, which became the backbone of the southern economy. The river provided fresh water for drinking and irrigation. It was a source of food, teeming with fish, waterfowl, and other wildlife that sustained both Native American tribes for centuries and the new settlers who arrived. The river dictated where people lived, how they built their homes, and even the rhythm of their lives, which were often governed by the seasonal floods. The strategic importance of the river also cannot be overstated, especially during the Civil War. The Union's Anaconda Plan was designed to squeeze the Confederacy by blockading its ports and, crucially, taking control of the Mississippi River. By capturing the river, the Union could effectively cut the Confederacy in two, separating Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the secessionist states. This would cut off vital supplies and troop movements. The campaign to control the river was long and bloody, culminating in the pivotal siege of Vicksburg. When Vicksburg fell to Ulysses S. Grant in July 1863, Abraham Lincoln famously wrote, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." It was a turning point in the war, proving just how essential the Mississippi was to the nation's very fabric. So, when we look at the Mississippi River, we're not just seeing a body of water. We're seeing the engine of westward expansion, the cradle of American commerce, a critical military objective, and a cultural touchstone that has inspired musicians, writers, and artists for generations. It was a superhighway that connected a fragmented nation, allowing it to grow and prosper. It was, without a doubt, America's lifeline. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Mississippi. I hope it gives you a new appreciation for this incredible river. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment that could have shattered the young United States before it truly found its footing. We're talking about Chapter 5, the New Orleans Problem. Imagine this. It's the late 1790s, early 1800s. The United States is still a fledgling nation, mostly clustered along the Atlantic coast. But there's a new wave of American spirit pushing westward, past the Appalachian Mountains. Farmers, trappers, and pioneers are settling the fertile lands of what we now call Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. They're carving out new lives, building communities, and producing a surplus of goods. For the first time, things like flour, tobacco, pork, butter, cheese, and lumber. But here's the catch. How do they get these goods to market? The mountains are a formidable barrier. Transporting bulky items over land back to the eastern cities is incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. It just wasn't practical. The natural highway for these western settlers was the river system. They could load their goods onto flatboats and keelboats and float them down the Mississippi River. It was the artery of the American frontier, the lifeline that connected their hard work to the wider world. And where did this mighty river lead? To the bustling, strategic port of New Orleans. For years, the Pinckney's Treaty of 1795 with Spain had been a godsend for these frontiersmen. It granted Americans the right of deposit in New Orleans. This meant they could ship their goods to the city, store them in warehouses, and then transfer them onto ocean-going vessels bound for the East Coast or even Europe, all without paying heavy taxes or duties. This right was absolutely essential. Without it, the economic viability of the entire Western territory was in jeopardy. Life on the frontier was tough enough. Without the ability to sell their produce, it would be impossible. Everything seemed to be working. The Western economy was growing, and settlers were pouring into the new territories, confident that their future was secure. Then, in 1801, a secret changed everything. Unbeknownst to the United States, Spain had secretly ceded the vast Louisiana territory, including New Orleans, back to France, which was now under the ambitious rule of Napoleon Bonaparte. For a while, Spanish officials continued to administer the port, and things went on as usual. American flatboats continued their journey down the Mississippi, and commerce flowed. President Thomas Jefferson knew about the secret treaty, and it deeply worried him. He famously wrote that the day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. He understood that having a weak Spain as a neighbor was one thing, but having the powerful and expansionist empire of Napoleon controlling America as most vital port was a geopolitical nightmare. The nightmare became a reality in October 1802. The Spanish intendant, or governor, in New Orleans, acting either on his own initiative or under secret orders from Spain or France, abruptly revoked the American right of deposit. Who'st like that the gate was slammed shut? The news hit the western settlements like a shockwave. Panic spread like wildfire. Imagine you're a farmer in Kentucky. You've spent an entire year toiling in the fields. You've invested all your money and labor into a crop, and you've loaded it onto a flatboat. You arrive in New Orleans, only to be told you can't unload your goods. Your cargo, your entire year's income, is now stuck on the river, rotting under the humid Louisiana sun. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. Warehouses were locked. Docks were closed to American vessels. The economic lifeblood of the American West was suddenly choked off. The reaction was immediate and furious. All along the frontier, from the Ohio Valley to the Tennessee Hills, there were cries for action. Many weren't just calling for diplomatic solutions. They were calling for war. Fiery editorials filled Western newspapers. Politicians demanded that the government seize New Orleans by force. The sentiment was clear. If the federal government didn't act to reopen the Mississippi, the Western states might just take matters into their own hands. Some even whispered about secession, about forming their own confederacy that could deal with France directly or align with another foreign power. The very unity of the United States was at stake. President Jefferson found himself in an incredibly difficult position. He was a man of peace who despised the idea of a large standing army and foreign entanglements. Yet, he was facing immense pressure from the warhawks in his own party. He knew that a war with Napoleonic France would be a disaster for the young nation. It would be costly in both blood and treasure and could potentially unravel the republic he had worked so hard to build. Jefferson had to walk a tightrope. He needed to calm the furious frontiersmen while also finding a peaceful solution to the crisis. He knew direct military confrontation was a last resort. So, he devised a plan, a diplomatic gamble that was as bold as it was risky. He decided to send a special envoy to Paris to negotiate. His choice was James Monroe, a respected Virginian with diplomatic experience. Jefferson instructed Monroe to join the American minister in France, Robert Livingston. Their mission was clear, but seemingly impossible: to purchase the city of New Orleans, and, if possible, the Florida territories from France. Jefferson authorized them to offer up to $10 million, a staggering sum for the time. It was a desperate attempt to buy a solution to the New Orleans problem. As Monroe prepared for his voyage across the Atlantic in early 1803, the fate of the nation hung in the balance. No one knew what Napoleon's true intentions were. Would he be willing to sell? Or was he planning to build a grand French empire in the heart of North America, effectively boxing in the United States and dooming its westward expansion forever? The clock was ticking. The anger on the frontier was reaching a boiling point, and the pressure on Jefferson was immense. The mission of Monroe and Livingston was more than just a real estate deal. It was a desperate bid to secure the future of the United States and prevent the nation from tearing itself apart. The stage was set for one of the most unexpected and transformative events in American history, and that's where we'll leave it for today. The crisis over New Orleans set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, Jefferson's Diplomatic Gamble. Imagine this. It's the dawn of the 19th century. America is a young, scrappy nation, and its future hinges on one crucial waterway, the Mississippi River. The lifeblood of American commerce flows down this river, but it all empties out through a single port city, New Orleans. And that city, it's controlled by a foreign power. President Thomas Jefferson knew this was a ticking time bomb. Control of New Orleans meant control over the American economy. So, what do you do when your nation's future is hanging by a thread? You take a gamble. A big one. Jefferson, a man known for his cautious nature and strict interpretation of the Constitution, decided it was time to play hardball on the world stage. He needed New Orleans. He knew that whoever held that port could either be America's greatest friend or its most dangerous enemy. The situation was getting tense. Spain had been controlling the territory, but whispers were growing louder that a secret deal had handed it back to France, led by the ambitious and unpredictable Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, in charge of America's economic jugular vein. That was a nightmare scenario for Jefferson. French control of New Orleans would not only choke American trade, but could also force the United States into an unwanted alliance with its old master, Great Britain, just to keep the French in check. Jefferson famously wrote that the day France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. That's how serious this was. The very independence of the United States was on the line. So, Jefferson set his plan in motion. He called upon two of his most trusted men for a mission that would change the course of American history. First, there was Robert Livingston. He was already in Paris, serving as the U.S. Minister to France. Livingston was a seasoned diplomat, a founding father himself, but he was having a tough time. The French foreign minister, the cunning Talleyrand, was giving him the runaround, denying everything about a secret deal with Spain. Livingston was frustrated, trying to get a straight answer but hitting a brick wall at every turn. Jefferson knew Livingston needed backup. He needed someone with fresh energy and the full authority of the president behind him. He chose James Monroe. Monroe was a Virginian, a fellow Republican, and a man Jefferson trusted implicitly. Sending Monroe was a powerful signal to France and to the American people. It showed everyone that Jefferson was taking this threat with the utmost seriousness. He gave Monroe specific instructions. Go to Paris, join Livingston, and negotiate. What was the goal? The primary mission was to buy the city of New Orleans. Jefferson was willing to authorize up to $10 million for it, a staggering sum at the time. He also told them to try and secure the territories of East and West Florida, if possible. This was the heart of the gamble. Jefferson, the champion of small government and limited spending, was preparing to make a massive land purchase. He was stretching the very limits of his presidential power, all to secure the nation's future. The journey from Monroe was long and perilous. In days crossing the Atlantic took weeks, sometimes months. All the while, the clock was ticking. Tensions were rising back home, especially among Western farmers and merchants who depended on the Mississippi. They were angry and talking of taking New Orleans by force. Jefferson had to manage this domestic pressure while Monroe raced against time to reach Paris. Every day of delay increased the risk of war. When Monroe finally arrived in Paris in the spring of 1803, he walked into a situation that had dramatically changed. Napoleon's grand colonial ambitions were crumbling. A massive French army sent to reclaim Haiti had been decimated by yellow fever and fierce local resistance. Without Haiti, the jewel of the French Caribbean, Napoleon's interest in a vast American empire, with Louisiana as its breadbasket, was fading fast. Plus, war with Britain was looming again, and Napoleon needed money. A lot of it. Suddenly, Livingston and Monroe weren't just negotiating for a city. The day before Monroe even arrived, the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, dropped a bombshell on Livingston. He casually asked, "What would you give for the whole of Louisiana?" Livingston was stunned. This wasn't part of the plan. They were sent to by a city and a small strip of land, not an entire territory that would double the size of their country. Monroe arrived right in the middle of this shocking new development. The two Americans now faced a decision far beyond their original instructions. They had no way to quickly contact Jefferson for approval. A message back to Washington, and a reply would take months. The opportunity was right there, right now, and it might disappear as quickly as it appeared. Napoleon was notoriously fickle. They had to decide. Could they do it? Did they even have the authority? They were authorized to spend $10 million on a city. Now, the French were offering an entire empire for $15 million. It was the deal of a lifetime, a landmass of over 800,000 square miles for mere pennies an acre. They had to weigh the risks. Exceeding their authority could lead to political ruin, but passing up this chance could be a historic failure, a missed opportunity that would never come again. Together, Livingston and Monroe made their choice. They decided to seize the moment. They agreed to Napoleon's price. They would purchase all of Louisiana. It was a bold, decisive move made by two diplomats thousands of miles from home with no direct orders from their president. They were betting on Jefferson's vision for the country, a vision of an empire of liberty stretching across the continent. They signed the treaty on April 30th. Now, all they could do was send the documents back across the ocean and wait for the president's reaction. Would Jefferson approve of this monumental and arguably unconstitutional act? He had sent them on a diplomatic mission to solve a crisis, and they were returning with a solution so vast, so transformative, that no one had ever dared to imagine it. Jefferson's gamble had paid off in a way he could never have predicted. The fate of the continent now rested on his shoulders, as he had to convince Congress and the American people to embrace this new, immense, and unknown future. And that's where we'll pick up next time. The story of the Louisiana Purchase is a testament to bold diplomacy and seizing unexpected opportunities. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. See you 10. Hello and welcome back to our deep dive into the Louisiana Purchase. Last time, we saw the American negotiators, Monroe and Livingston, arrive in Paris with a mandate to buy New Orleans. They were about to step into a situation far more complex and advantageous than they could have ever imagined. Today, in Chapter 7, we're flipping the script to look at things from the other side of the Atlantic. We re-peeling back the layers of one of history's most enigmatic figures to understand Napoleon Bonaparte's hidden motives. Why would the man who was conquering Europe suddenly decide to sell off a territory larger than his entire continent? The answer is a tangled web of ambition, failure, and cold, hard pragmatism. By 1803, Napoleon's grand vision for a renewed French empire in the Americas was, to put it bluntly, falling apart. The cornerstone of this dream was the incredibly wealthy sugar-producing colony of Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti. This wasn't just some minor island outpost. It was the jewel of the French colonial crown, producing a staggering amount of sugar and coffee, and generating immense wealth for France. Napoleon's plan was simple. Use the vast, fertile lands of Louisiana as a breadbasket. Louisiana would supply the grain, timber, and other resources needed to feed and support the massive enslaved workforce in Saint-Domingue. This would create a self-sufficient, transatlantic economic powerhouse, freeing France from its reliance on American trade and cementing its dominance in the New World. It was a brilliant plan, on paper. However, Reality has a way of derailing even the most brilliant plans. The people of Saint-Domingue had other ideas. The Haitian Revolution, a powerful and historic struggle for freedom, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, had been raging for years. Napoleon, underestimating the resolve of the revolutionaries, dispatched a massive military force under the command of his brother, Charles Leclerc, to crush the rebellion and reinstate slavery. It was a brutal, bloody conflict. Initially, the French forces seemed to have the upper hand. They captured Louverture through treachery and deported him to a French prison, where he would later die. But the fight for freedom was far from over. The French army soon found itself battling not only determined former slaves, but also a far deadlier enemy, yellow fever. The disease swept through the anathematized European troops, decimating their ranks. It was relentless and terrifying. Soldiers were dying in droves, including General Leclerc himself. The dream of reconquering Saint-Domingue was turning into a horrifying nightmare. The cost in both lives and money was astronomical, and the colony, far from being a source of wealth, had become a bottomless pit, swallowing up French soldiers and treasure. Napoleon, a man who prided himself on logic and results, was forced to confront a harsh truth. His Caribbean ambitions were dead in the water. With Saint-Domingue lost, the primary reason for holding on to Louisiana evaporated. The breadbasket had no one left to feed. Louisiana, on its own, was a vast, largely undeveloped wilderness. It was expensive to administer, difficult to defend, and its potential value was a long-term prospect. Napoleon wasn't a man known for his patience. He needed resources, and he needed them now. His attention was shifting back to where he felt most comfortable. The battlefields of Europe. He was already planning his next series of campaigns, which would eventually become the Napoleonic Wars. And wars, as we all know, are incredibly expensive. Adding to this pressure was the ever-present threat of Great Britain. The brief peace between France and Britain was collapsing. Napoleon knew that as soon as war was declared, which seemed inevitable, the Royal Navy would dominate the seas. What would be the first thing to fall? The remote and vulnerable French colony of Louisiana. Britain, with its powerful navy and its bases in Canada, could easily sail down the Mississippi and seize New Orleans. Napoleon was faced with a choice. Let Louisiana be conquered by his most hated enemy, getting nothing in return, or sell it to the neutral, and far less threatening, Americans, and get something for it. For a man like Napoleon, the decision was a simple matter of calculation. He couldn't defend Louisiana. He didn't really need it anymore, and he desperately needed money for his European wars. Selling it was the only logical move. It would turn a useless, vulnerable asset into cold, hard cash. It would also, in a delightful strategic bonus, strengthen the United States. Napoleon astutely predicted that a larger, more powerful United States would eventually become a significant commercial and naval rival to Great Britain. In his own words, he saw the sale as creating a maritime rival for England that would sooner or later humble her pride. He wasn't just cutting his losses, he was playing a long game, setting up a future check on British power. So, as Livingston and Monroe fretted in Paris, trying to figure out how to acquire a single port city, Napoleon was already several steps ahead. He wasn't thinking about New Orleans. He was thinking about Europe, about Britain, and about his legacy. He had decided to liquidate his entire American portfolio. On April 10, 1803, he summoned his finance minister Francois Barbe Maboy and made his shocking declaration. He intended to sell all of Louisiana. The stage was now set for one of the most astonishing real estate deals in history. The Americans had come to buy a house and were about to be offered a continent. What happens when this incredible offer is put on the table? We'll find out next time. Thank you so much for joining me on this historical journey today. If you're enjoying this series and want to see how this incredible story unfolds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below with your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Imagine you're an American diplomat in Paris, back in 1803. Your name is Robert Livingston. You've been sent by President Thomas Jefferson with a clear but very specific mission. By the city of New Orleans. That's it. Just New Orleans. Why? Because it's the gateway to the Mississippi River. the superhighway of trade for American farmers in the West. Controlling that port is crucial for the young nation's economy. Jefferson gave you a budget of $10 million, a huge sum at the time, just for that one city, and maybe a little bit of surrounding land. You've been negotiating for months with Napoleon Bonaparte's foreign minister, a cunning and slippery character named Talleyrand. But you're getting nowhere. The French are playing hard to get, and you're starting to feel the pressure. Every day that passes is another day. American goods can't freely move down the Mississippi. Just when you're about to lose hope, President Jefferson decides to send backup. He dispatches James Monroe, a future president himself, to join you in Paris. Monroe arrives with the same instructions. Secure New Orleans. The two of you meet with Talleyrand, ready for another round of frustrating, circular negotiations. You brace yourselves, expecting to haggle over every square inch of land, every dollar in the price. But then, Talleyrand drops a bombshell that no one, absolutely no one, saw coming. He looks at you and, with a nonchalant air, asks a question that will forever change the map of the United States. He doesn't just offer you New Orleans. He asks, what will you give for the whole of Louisiana? The whole of Louisiana. You and Monroe are stunned into silence. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't even in the realm of possibility. It's hard to overstate how shocking this moment was. The Louisiana Territory wasn't just a plot of land. It was an empire. It stretched from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Canadian border. We're talking about an area of 828,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, this territory would eventually become all or part of 15 future American states. And France was offering to sell the entire thing. It was like going to a car dealership to buy a new set of tires and having the salesman offer you the entire factory. Livingston and Monroe were completely floored. They had instructions and a budget for a single city, not a subcontinent. They had no authority to make such a massive purchase, and there was no way to get a quick answer from President Jefferson. A message by ship across the Atlantic would take weeks, if not months. So why the sudden, dramatic change of heart from Napoleon? Just a short time before, he had grand visions for a new French empire in North America, with Louisiana as its breadbasket. The key to this plan was the incredibly wealthy sugar-producing colony of Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti. But Napoleon's plans hit a massive snag. A massive and successful slave rebellion, led by the brilliant General Toussaint Louverture, was raging in Haiti. Napoleon sent a huge army to crush the revolt and restore French authority. But it was a disaster. The French soldiers were not prepared for the fierce resistance or the devastating effects of yellow fever, which wiped out thousands of them. His dream of a North American empire was crumbling into dust, and the crown jewel of that empire, Saint-Domingue, was lost. With the failure in Haiti, Louisiana suddenly became a lot less valuable to Napoleon. Without Saint-Domingue to feat, what was the point of holding onto a vast, difficult-to-defend wilderness in North America? Furthermore, Napoleon had other, more pressing concerns. Tensions with Great Britain were rising again, and he knew another war was on the horizon. Wars are incredibly expensive, and Napoleon needed money, and he needed it fast. That massive, untamed territory across the ocean started to look less like an asset and more like a liability. It was hard to manage, vulnerable to British or even American expansion, and, most importantly, it could be turned into cold, hard cash to fund his armies in Europe. Napoleon was a pragmatist. His American dream was dead, but his European ambitions were very much alive. Selling Louisiana was a quick and easy way to solve a number of his problems at once. Bike, in Paris, Livingston, and Monroe are in a bind. This offer is beyond anything they could have imagined. It's the deal of a lifetime. A chance to literally double the size of their country overnight. But they have no authorization. If they accept, they are massively overstepping their authority. President Jefferson might disavow the deal. Congress might refuse to fund it. They could be committing political suicide. But if they refuse, or even hesitate for too long, the opportunity could vanish forever. Napoleon was known for his impulsive decisions. He could change his mind tomorrow. The British could get wind of it and try to seize the territory themselves. The weight of the nation's future rested on their shoulders. It was a monumental gamble. They had to make a decision right then and there, relying on their own judgment and patriotism. After a brief, tense period of deliberation, they decided to seize the moment. They knew this was an opportunity that could never be repeated. They entered into negotiations, not for New Orleans, but for the entire Louisiana territory. The French initially asked for a much higher price, but they haggled. Talleyrand was a master negotiator, but the Americans held firm. Finally, they agreed on a price: $15 million. That's about 3 cents an acre. It's widely considered one of the greatest real estate deals in all of history, for just $5 million more than their original budget for a single city. They were getting an entire empire. On April 30th, 1803, they signed the treaty without a single phone call or email, relying on their own initiative and foresight. Robert Livingston and James Monroe had just doubled the size of the United States. Now all they had to do was tell the president. When the news finally reached Washington, D.C. weeks later, Jefferson was both thrilled and conflicted. He was ecstatic about the acquisition of so much land, which fulfilled his vision of an empire of liberty for yeoman farmers. But he was also a strict constructionist of the Constitution. He believed the federal government only had the powers explicitly listed in the document, and nowhere did the Constitution say the president could buy foreign territory. He was genuinely worried that the purchase was unconstitutional. He even drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize it, but his advisors warned him that the process would take too long. Napoleon might back out of the deal. In the end, pragmatism won out over principle. Jefferson put aside his constitutional doubts and urged Congress to approve the treaty and appropriate the funds. The Senate ratified the treaty in October 1803, and the United States formally took possession of the territory in a ceremony in New Orleans that December. The French flag was lowered, and the American flag was raised. Who's like that the United States was transformed from a coastal nation clinging to the Atlantic into a transcontinental power with a destiny that stretched far to the west. This single, unexpected offer from a French minister in Paris set in motion a chain of events that would define America for the next century, sparking westward expansion, exploration, and, unfortunately, new and bitter conflicts. But it all started in that one room in Paris, with an offer that nobody, not even the men who accepted it, ever expected. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible chapter of American history. It just goes to show how a single moment, a single decision, can change the course of a nation. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you want to forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you want to miss our next chapter. We've got so many more amazing stories to share with you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Start of video. Welcome back, history buffs. We're diving right back into the action. Last time, we left our American envoys, Robert Livingston and James Monroe, in a pretty tight spot in Paris. Their mission: to buy New Orleans. Simple, right? Well, things were about to get a whole lot more complicated and a whole lot bigger. Imagine this. You go to the store to buy a carton of milk, and the cashier offers you the entire supermarket for just a little more money. That's basically what happened to Livingston and Monroe. They were in Paris, trying to secure just the port of New Orleans for maybe $10 million. They knew it was crucial for American trade, a vital artery for the farmers and merchants west of the Up. Without it, the mighty Mississippi River was like a highway with a permanent roadblock. But Napoleon Bonaparte, the man holding all the cards, had other plans. His grand vision of a French empire in North America was crumbling. The jewel of his planned empire, the colony of Saint-Domingue, what we now know as Haiti, was an open and successful revolt, led by the brilliant Toussaint Louverture. The formerly enslaved population had fought for their freedom and weren't giving it up. A massive French army sent to crush the rebellion was being decimated, not just by the fierce fighting, but by yellow fever. Napoleon's dream was turning into a nightmare. His troops were dying, the costs were spiraling, and he needed money, fast. War with Britain was brewing again, and wars are expensive. So, Napoleon looked at the vast, sprawling territory of Louisiana, an enormous swath of land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and saw not an empire, but a piggy bank. It was difficult to defend, sparsely populated by French settlers, and right next to the ambitious, ever-expanding United States. Holding on to it seemed like more trouble than it was worth. This is where the story takes a wild turn. One day, the French finance minister, a man named Marboy, casually approached Robert Livingston. He didn't just talk about New Orleans. He asked, "What would you give for the whole of Louisiana?" Livingston was stunned. This wasn't part of the plan. He and Monroe had instructions to buy a city, not a subcontinent. They had no authority, no permission from President Jefferson to make a deal of this magnitude. Think about the pressure. There were no cell phones, no email, no instant way to contact Washington. A letter would take weeks, if not months, to cross the Atlantic and return. Napoleon was an impatient man. The offer was on the table now, but it might not be there tomorrow. If they sighed no, the opportunity could vanish forever. If they said yes, they were wildly overstepping their authority. It was a gamble of epic proportions. The negotiations began in a flurry of secret meetings and hurried discussions. Monroe had just arrived in Paris, literally just days before, expecting a tough, drawn-out haggle over a single port. Instead, he was thrown into the deal of a lifetime. The Americans initially offered around $4 million, still thinking in terms of just New Orleans. The French scoffed. Marboy, knowing Napoleon's desperation for cash, pushed for a much higher number. The back and forth was intense. The French wanted 100 million francs. The Americans hesitated. Was this even constitutional? Could the president just buy foreign land? There was nothing in the Constitution that explicitly said he could. They were operating in a gray area, making it up as they went along. But the prize was just too great to ignore. The chance to double the size of the United States, to secure the Mississippi River once and for all, and to remove a powerful European neighbor from their backyard was a nation-defining opportunity. Finally, they settled on a price: 60 million francs for the territory itself, and another 20 million francs to settle debts owed by France to American citizens. The grand total came to 80 million francs, which translated to about $15 million at the time. $15 million for 828,000 square miles of land. That works out to something like 3 cents an acre. It's been called the greatest real estate deal in history, and it's hard to argue with that. On April 30th, 1803, the treaty was signed. Livingston, Monroe, and Marboy put their names to the documents that would change the face of North America forever. Livingston famously remarked, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. From this day, the United States take their place among the powers of the first rank." He knew, even in that moment, the immense significance of what they had just done. They had gone to Paris to buy a porch and had come home with the entire palace. But signing the treaty was only half the battle. Now, they had to sell the deal back home. President Jefferson, the man who had always championed a strict interpretation of the Constitution, was about to face a massive dilemma. He had authorized the purchase of a city, but his envoys were bringing him an empire. How would he justify this monumental and technically unauthorized act to Congress and the American people? The news of the $15 million deal was on its way across the Atlantic, and with it, a political firestorm was about to ignite in Washington. The story isn't over yet. The ink was dry in Paris, but the debate in America was just beginning. Would this incredible deal be ratified, or would it be rejected as an unconstitutional overreach of power? We'll explore that political showdown in our next chapter. Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying this journey through American history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Ring that notification bell, and we'll see you in the next episode as we bring the Louisiana Purchase home. Welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 10, Constitutional Doubts. Imagine this. You've just pulled off the deal of a lifetime, a bargain that will literally double the size of your country overnight. You've secured a future of prosperity and expansion for generations to come. You should be celebrating, right? Well, if you're Thomas Jefferson in 1803, you're actually having a full-blown crisis of conscience. This is the fascinating paradox at the heart of the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson, our third president, was the nation's foremost champion of a strict, literal interpretation of the Constitution. His entire political philosophy, the very foundation of his Democratic Republican Party, was built on the idea that the federal government should only wield powers explicitly granted to it in that sacred document. Anything more was a step towards the kind of tyranny they had fought a revolution to escape. He had spent years arguing against the Federalists, like Alexander Hamilton, precisely on this point, accusing them of stretching the Constitution's meaning to grab more power. He believed in a limited federal government, with most powers remaining with the states and the people. So, when the opportunity arose to buy the vast Louisiana territory from Napoleon's France for a mere $15 million, Jefferson found himself in an agonizing position. The deal was undeniably brilliant. It secured the vital port of New Orleans, which was the gateway for all American commerce on the Mississippi River. It removed a powerful European empire from America's backyard, reducing the threat of future wars, and it provided an almost unimaginable expanse of land for his vision of an empire of liberty. A nation of independent yeoman farmers. It was, by any measure, a geopolitical masterstroke that would define America's destiny. But there was one rather significant problem. Jefferson scoured the text of the Constitution, the document he knew so intimately. He read it forwards and backwards, and nowhere could he find a single clause, a single sentence, that gave the President or Congress the authority to purchase foreign territory and incorporate it into the United States. It simply wasn't there. The power to acquire new lands was not one of the enumerated powers. This threw him into a state of profound intellectual and political turmoil. For years, he had been the staunchest critic of what he saw as federal overreach. He had railed against Hamilton's creation of a national bank, arguing it was unconstitutional because the power to create a bank wasn't explicitly listed. Now, here he was, contemplating an action that seemed to fly in the face of his own deeply held principles. Was he about to become the very thing he had always opposed? A hypocrite who would bend the rules for his own convenience. His mind raced. He knew his political enemies. The Federalists would have a field day. They would gleefully point out the contradiction, accusing him of abandoning his principles the moment it suited his political goals. And they wouldn't be entirely wrong. The irony was almost too much to bear. Jefferson, the strict constructionist, was about to engage in one of the most significant acts of loose construction in American history. Initially, Jefferson's solution was to seek a constitutional amendment. This was the proper, lawful way to handle it. He drafted an amendment that would explicitly grant the federal government the power to acquire new territory. This would retroactively justify the Louisiana Purchase and set a clear precedent for the future, all while staying true to his constitutional ideals. He felt this was the only honorable path forward. It was a clean, principled solution that would put the government's actions on solid legal ground. He wrote to his allies in Congress, explaining his predicament and pushing for the amendment. He believed it was essential to not make the Constitution a blank paper by construction. He warned that if they allowed the executive to take such a monumental step without clear constitutional authority, they would be setting a dangerous precedent. What would stop a future president from using this same logic to justify even greater overreaches of power? He was genuinely worried about the long-term health of the republic. However, his advisors and allies on the ground in Washington had a different perspective. They were far more pragmatic. His Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Cajatin, and others urged him to reconsider. They sent urgent messages back to Monticello, warning him of the immense risks of delay. Napoleon was notoriously fickle. The deal was on the table, now asterisk, but it might not be tomorrow. What if Napoleon changed his mind? What if Spain, which was still technically in control of the territory, decided to make trouble? What if Great Britain tried to swoop in and seize New Orleans while the Americans were busy debating constitutional law? The window of opportunity was small and closing fast. They argued that the chance to secure the nation's future was too important to risk on what they saw as a legal technicality. They reminded him that the power to make treaties was explicitly granted to the president in the Constitution. Couldn't the purchase be framed as part of a treaty with France? This was a clever argument. The Constitution gives the president the power to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. If the land purchase could be structured as a treaty, it would have a firm constitutional footing. This argument presented Jefferson with a way out, a legal justification he could use. It was a classic loose constructionist argument, the very kind he had spent his career fighting against. It involved interpreting the treaty-making power more broadly than just for peace or alliances. It meant stretching the definition to include the acquisition of vast new lands, and, by extension, the future citizens who lived there. Jefferson wrestled with this. He was torn between his rigid principles and the stunningly practical benefits of the purchase. On one hand was his constitutional purity, the intellectual foundation of his political life. On the other was a once-in-a-history opportunity to guarantee the security and prosperity of the United States for a century or more. He confided in his letters that he was stretching his power till it cracked. It was a decision that caused him genuine anguish. In the end, pragmatism won. Jefferson reluctantly abandoned his push for a constitutional amendment. He accepted the argument that the treaty-making power provided sufficient, if not perfect, constitutional cover. He reasoned that the good of the nation, in this extraordinary circumstance, had to take precedence. He rationalized it as an exception, a unique case where the executive had to act for the greater good, and he would later throw himself on the mercy of the country for its approval. He submitted a treaty to the Senate for ratification. His political opponents, the Federalists, ironically, now took up the banner of strict construction. They argued vehemently that the purchase was unconstitutional, using Jefferson's own past arguments against him. They also raised fears that these new Western territories would dilute the power of the original Eastern states. But their protests were largely ignored. The deal was simply too good to pass up. The Senate quickly ratified the treaty in October of 1803, and the United States officially took possession of the Louisiana Territory in December. And so, Thomas Jefferson, the great champion of limited government, presided over the single largest expansion of federal power and territory in American history. This chapter of his presidency reveals a man far more complex and pragmatic than his political philosophy might suggest. He was forced to choose between his ideals and the practical needs of the nation he led. His decision to proceed with the Louisiana Purchase, despite his profound constitutional doubts, demonstrates the incredible pressures of leadership and the messy realities of governing, where rigid ideology often has to bend to extraordinary opportunity. It is a fascinating look at how a leader's principles are tested when they collide with a world-changing event. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Jefferson's dilemma. It's a crucial moment that shaped not just the map, but the very character of the American government. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so leave your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. The news reached Washington like a thunderclap, echoing through the halls of power and spilling out onto the bustling streets. The deal, a pact that would forever alter the destiny of the United States, had been struck, but the signature on the parchment in Paris was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead, in the chambers of the U.S. Senate. President Jefferson, a man of vision and pragmatism, knew the battle for ratification would be fierce. He had, after all, stretched the very fabric of his constitutional authority to seize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. His political opponents, the Federalists, were sharpening their knives, decrying the purchase as an unconstitutional overreach, a foolish waste of public funds on a vast, unknown wilderness. They painted grim pictures of a nation bankrupted and a union torn asunder. The debate that ensued was one of the most consequential in American history. Senators rose, their voices ringing with passion and conviction. Some argued the Constitution provided no explicit power for the president to acquire foreign territory. Was this not the act of a king, rather than the leader of a republic? They questioned the wisdom of incorporating a vast and diverse population, people of different languages, cultures, and laws, into the American fold. "Oh, cool this howling wilderness," as one senator derisively called it, ever be governed. They warned that the addition of new Western states would dilute the power of the original Eastern states, shifting the center of political gravity and threatening the very foundations of the Union. The cost, a staggering $15 million, was another point of furious contention. In an era when the entire federal budget was a fraction of that amount, it seemed an astronomical sum to pay for what many considered a worthless expanse of swamps and plains. But for every voice of doubt, another rose in resounding support. Jefferson's allies, the Democratic Republicans, framed the debate not as a constitutional crisis, but as a moment of unparalleled national opportunity. They argued that control of the Mississippi River and the vital port of New Orleans was not a luxury, but a necessity for the nation's economic survival and security, for the farmers and merchants of the West, whose livelihoods depended on floating their goods downriver. This was a matter of life and death. They painted a vibrant picture of the future, a republic of independent, landowning farmers, the very bedrock of Jefferson's democratic vision, spreading across a continent. This wasn't just buying land, it was buying an empire for liberty. They countered the constitutional arguments by invoking the president's treaty-making powers, insisting that the acquisition of territory was an inherent aspect of national sovereignty. The price, they contended, was a bargain, a pittance for an area that would double the size of the country and secure its future for generations to come. The arguments raged, day after day. Newspapers across the country printed every fiery speech, and the public followed the proceedings with bated breath. The fate of the nation seemed to hang in the balance. Would they seize this incredible gift, this chance to shape their own destiny on a continental scale, or would they let it slip away, constrained by fear and partisan bickering? Jefferson himself worked tirelessly behind the scenes, using his political influence to persuade wavering senators. He understood the stakes better than anyone. This was more than just a real estate transaction. It was the key to unlocking America's potential, ensuring its growth and prosperity, and keeping it free from the entanglements of European powers who coveted the vast American interior. The pressure was immense. Finally, on October 20th, 1803, the moment of truth arrived. The senators cast their votes. The chamber fell silent as the tally was counted. Then, the result was announced. The treaty was ratified by a vote of 24-7. A wave of relief and exhilaration swept through the supporters. The constitutional gamble had paid off. The Louisiana Purchase was officially part of the United States. The news spread like wildfire. Church bells pealed in celebration from Boston to Savannah. In Washington, cannons boomed in Saluki, their roar a proclamation of a new era. Newspapers printed special editions with banner headlines heralding the greatest transaction in history. The United States had just doubled in size, not through war or conquest, but through diplomacy and a bold, decisive act of statesmanship. Across the young nation, the mood was electric. It was a moment of profound national pride and optimism. The acquisition wasn't just seen as a strategic victory, it was a validation of the American experiment itself. It affirmed the belief that the United States was a nation of destiny, destined to expand and thrive. Toasts were raised in taverns and grand halls to President Jefferson and the new, vastly expanded republic. People marveled at the sheer scale of it. 828,000 square miles of land, stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains, acquired for mere pennies an acre. It was a land of unimaginable resources and infinite possibility. For the average American, it meant the promise of cheap land, a fresh start, and the chance to build a better life for their children. It ignited the national imagination. This celebration, however, was not universal. The Federalists, defeated in the Senate, remained deeply skeptical. They saw the public's jubilation as naive and short-sighted, and they continued to predict dire consequences. And, in the vast territory itself, the news was received with a complex mix of uncertainty and apprehension. French and Spanish Creoles in New Orleans, Native American tribes whose ancestral lands were now claimed by a distant government none, had been consulted. For them, this was not a celebration, but the dawn of an uncertain and potentially disrupted future under new rulers. Their stories, often overlooked in the triumphant narrative, are a crucial part of this complex chapter in American history. The celebration in the East was, in many ways, a celebration of a future that had yet to be written, a future that would be forged in the vast, contested spaces of the new American West. But in the fall of 1803, for the majority of Americans, these concerns were distant echoes. The dominant feeling was one of monumental achievement. The nation had faced a critical test and emerged stronger, larger, and more confident than ever before. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a political or diplomatic event. It was a cultural one. It fundamentally reshaped how Americans saw themselves and their country's place in the world. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief in an ordained expansion across the continent, began to take root in the national consciousness. The stage was now set for the next great chapter of the American story: the exploration and settlement of this immense new domain. The journey of Lewis and Clark was about to begin, an expedition that would transform the abstract lines on a map into a tangible, breathtaking reality. The celebration of 1803 was, in essence, a celebration of the beginning of the American West and the dawn of a continental nation. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our journey through American history. It's your support that makes these deep dives possible. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you and miss what's coming next. We love hearing from you, so drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on this monumental event. We'll see you in the next video. Hello history lovers, and welcome back to our channel. Today, we're diving into a story that literally reshaped a nation. We're talking about a deal so massive, it doubled the size of the United States overnight. This is Chapter 12, the Louisiana Territory revealed. Imagine it's the year 1800. The young United States is a sliver of a country, mostly clinging to the Atlantic coast. To the west lies a vast, uncharted wilderness, stretching from the mighty Mississippi River all the way to the towering Rocky Mountains. This was the Louisiana Territory, on an immense expanse of nearly 830,000 square miles. A land of sprawling plains, dense forests, and winding rivers, shrouded in mystery. For Americans, the Mississippi River was more than just a body of water. It was a lifeline. Farmers in Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee floated their crops downriver to the port of New Orleans, where they were loaded onto ships bound for the East Coast in Europe. Control of New Orleans was everything. So, when Spain, which had controlled the territory, secretly ceded it back to France and its ambitious leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, in 1800, alarm bells started ringing in Washington, D.C. President Thomas Jefferson, a man who dreamed of an empire of liberty stretching across the continent, saw the French flag in New Orleans as a major threat. A powerful, aggressive France controlling America's most vital port could choke the nation's westward expansion and economic growth. Initially, Jefferson's goal wasn't to buy the entire territory. He simply wanted to secure New Orleans and the Floridas. He dispatched his envoys, James Monroe and Robert Livingston, to Paris with an offer of up to $10 million for the port city. But Napoleon had bigger problems. His dreams of a new French empire in the Americas were crumbling. A massive slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, had proven disastrous and costly. Furthermore, war with Britain was looming on the horizon, and Napoleon needed money. A lot of it, the Louisiana Territory, so far away and difficult to defend, suddenly looked less like an asset and more like a liability he could cash in. So, in a stunning turn of events, Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand, asked the American negotiators a shocking question. How much would they pay for the entire Louisiana Territory? Livingston and Monroe were floored. This went far beyond their instructions. They had no authority to make such a monumental purchase, but they knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. After some quick and tense negotiations, they agreed on a price. 60 million francs, or about $15 million. That's less than 4 cents an acre. It was, and still is, one of the greatest real estate deals in history. Back in the United States, the news was met with both excitement and controversy. Jefferson, a strict constructionist of the Constitution, faced a dilemma. The Constitution said nothing about a president having the power to purchase foreign land. He worried he was overstepping his authority, but the strategic and economic importance of the deal was undeniable. Ultimately, he reasoned that the president's treaty-making powers allowed for the purchase and urged Congress to approve it, which they did in October 1803. On December 20th, 1803, in a ceremony in New Orleans, the French flag was lowered and the stars and stripes were raised. Just like that, the United States had doubled in size. But what exactly had they bought? No one really knew. The territory's boundaries were vague, its geography was unknown, and its interior was a complete mystery to Americans. It was a land inhabited by dozens of Native American tribes, home to vast herds of bison, and filled with landscapes no American had ever seen. To answer these questions, Jefferson launched one of history's most famous expeditions. He commissioned his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and an army officer, William Clark, to lead the Corps of Discovery. Their mission was to explore this new territory, find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, establish trade with Native American tribes, and document the region's plants, animals, and geography. In May of 1804, the Corps of Discovery set off from St. Louis, heading up the Missouri River. Their journey was an epic of survival, discovery, and diplomacy. They navigated treacherous waters, endured harsh winters, and encountered numerous Native American nations. From the Sioux and the Mandan on the plains to the Shoshone and Nez in the mountains. Central to their success was a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. She joined the expedition with her husband and baby, serving as an interpreter and a crucial symbol of peace to the tribes they met. Her knowledge of the land and its people proved invaluable, especially as they crossed the daunting Rocky Mountains. After nearly a year and a half of incredible hardship and breathtaking discovery, they reached the Pacific Ocean in the fall of 1805. They had proven that a continuous water route did not exist, but they returned in 1806 with a treasure trove of information. Their detailed maps, scientific specimens, and journals opened a window into the West, firing the imagination of the American people and paving the way for future settlement. The Louisiana Purchase was a pivotal moment in American history. It secured the nation's future, fueled the spirit of westward expansion, and set the stage for the United States to become a continental power. It was a bold, unexpected move that transformed the landscape and the destiny of a nation, turning a mysterious wilderness into the heartland of America. The journey into this new land was just beginning, and its legacy continues to shape the country we know today. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey back in time. If you enjoyed this exploration of the Louisiana Territory, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter in history. We'll see you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're re-diving into one of the most incredible adventures in American history, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Imagine this. It's 1803, and the United States has just made a monumental purchase from France, the Louisiana Purchase. Overnight, the country nearly doubled in size. But here's the thing. Most of this new territory was a complete mystery. It was a vast, uncharted wilderness that no American had ever explored. Enter President Thomas Jefferson. He was a man of immense curiosity, a true product of the Enlightenment. He wasn't just a politician. He was a scientist, an architect, and a visionary. Jefferson dreamed of a United States that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific, an empire of liberty. But to achieve that, he needed to know what was out there, and needed the map's scientific data, and a way to establish trade with the Native American tribes who called this land home. So, Jefferson conceived a daring plan, a government-sponsored expedition to explore this new frontier. He needed a leader, someone tough, resourceful, and trustworthy. His choice fell upon his personal secretary, a young army captain named Meriwether Lewis. Lewis was intelligent, a skilled outdoorsman, and had a knack for observation. Jefferson knew he had the right man for the job, but Lewis knew he couldn't do it alone. This journey would be far too dangerous and complex for one person. He needed a co-commander, someone he could rely on completely. He chose his old friend from the army, William Clark. Clark was a brilliant frontiersman, an expert boatman, and a master cartographer. He was practical, charismatic, and had a deep understanding of the challenges they would face. Together, they were the perfect team. Lewis, the thoughtful scientist, and Clark, the seasoned pioneer. Their mission, commissioned by Jefferson himself, was multifaceted and incredibly ambitious. First, they were to find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, the legendary Northwest Passage. For centuries, explorers had dreamed of this direct waterway, believing it would unlock immense trade potential with Asia. Jefferson hoped the Missouri River would lead them right to it. Second, they were tasked with being scientists and naturalists. Jefferson instructed them to document everything they saw: the plants, the animals, the climate, the geology. They were to collect samples, draw sketches, and create a detailed scientific record of this new world. Think of them as the first natural historians of the American West, discovering hundreds of species unknown to Western science at the time, from grizzly bears to prairie dogs. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they were to act as diplomats. They were instructed to establish peaceful relations with the numerous Native American tribes they would encounter. They were to inform these tribes that their land now belonged to the United States and to promote trade. This was a delicate and crucial part of their mission, a diplomatic dance in an unknown territory with people whose languages and customs were completely new to them. To accomplish all this, they assembled a team known as the Corps of Discovery. This wasn't just a group of soldiers. It was a hand-picked crew of skilled hunters, blacksmiths, carpenters, and interpreters. They were all young, hardy, and ready for the adventure of a lifetime. The group even included Clark's enslaved African American, York, whose presence fascinated many of the native tribes they met. In the spring of 1804, after months of meticulous preparation in St. Louis, the Corps of Discovery was finally ready. They loaded their supplies onto a 55-foot keelboat and two smaller piers. Inside were tools, weapons, scientific instruments, and gifts for the Native American tribes, beads, mirrors, and peace medals stamped with Jefferson's image. On May 14, 1804, they set off from Camp Dubois, pushing their boats against the powerful current of the Missouri River. As they left the familiar settlements behind, they entered a world of endless prairies, dense forests, and towering bluffs. Every day brought new challenges and new wonders. They battled swarms of mosquitoes, endured scorching heat and violent thunderstorms, and struggled to navigate the treacherous, ever-shifting river. Their journey up the Missouri was a grueling test of endurance. The men would often have to get out and pull the heavy boats upstream with ropes from the riverbanks. They hunted for their food, relying on the abundant game deer, elk, and buffalo. Clark meticulously mapped their progress, creating the first accurate charts of the Missouri River, while Lewis filled his journals with detailed descriptions of the flora and fauna they encountered. Along the way, they held councils with various native tribes, like the Oto and the Missouri. Following Jefferson's script, they would perform a formal ceremony, parading in their military uniforms, firing their guns, and presenting the chiefs with medals and gifts. They would explain that a new great father in Washington now ruled the land and that they had come in peace to open up trade. The reactions from the tribes were mixed, ranging from curiosity and cooperation to suspicion and caution. As the summer of 1804 turned to fall, the Corps pushed deeper into the territory of the powerful Sioux tribes. Tensions rose during an encounter with the Teton Sioux, where a misunderstanding nearly led to a violent conflict. Only Clark's calm diplomacy and the Chief Black Buffalo's intervention prevented bloodshed. This event was a stark reminder of the constant danger they were in and the cultural divides they had to navigate. Winter was fast approaching, and they needed to find a place to build a fort and wait out the harsh northern plains winter. They traveled nearly 1,600 miles before they reached the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa people, in what is now North Dakota. The Mandan were welcoming and accustomed to trading with other groups, and the Corps decided to build their winter quarters. Fort Mandan, nearby. This winter proved to be a pivotal moment in the expedition. It was here they met two individuals who would become indispensable to their success. The first was a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, but it was his young Shoshone wife who would become a legend, Sacagawea. She was only a teenager and had recently given birth to a son, Hien Baptiste. Sacagawea's value to the expedition cannot be overstated. She wasn't just an interpreter. Her very presence, a woman with a baby, signaled to other tribes that this was a peaceful party, not a war party. She was also incredibly knowledgeable about the land, identifying edible plants and roots that helped supplement the men's diet. Her story is one of resilience and strength, a young woman navigating a world of men in a journey that would change a nation. With the arrival of spring in 1805, the ice on the Missouri River broke. The expedition split. A small group returned to St. Louis, carrying Lewis's first reports, maps, and scientific specimens back to President Jefferson. The rest of the Corps, now joined by Sacagawea, Charbonneau, and their baby, continued westward into the unknown. They were now heading towards the Rocky Mountains, the greatest physical barrier that stood between them and the Pacific. This next leg of the journey was even more challenging. They faced waterfalls, grizzly bears, and the daunting task of crossing the massive mountain range. Their success, and indeed their survival, would depend on their courage, their teamwork, and the guidance of their young Shoshone companion. This was the true test, the moment where the dream of a transcontinental nation would either be realized or lost in the vast wilderness of the American West. And that's where we'll pause for today. The story of Lewis and Clark is a testament to human curiosity, endurance, and the complex, often fraught, beginnings of American expansion. Join us next time as we follow the course of discovery across the formidable Rocky Mountains and all the way to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our journey through history. In this chapter, we delve into one of the most pivotal and complex aspects of American expansion: the encounters with native nations. As pioneers and settlers moved westward, they didn't step into an empty land. They entered a continent that had been home to hundreds of diverse and vibrant indigenous cultures for millennia. These meetings were rarely simple. They were a mix of curiosity, trade, conflict, and misunderstanding. We'll explore the initial interactions, the treaties that were made and often broken, and the profound, lasting impact this westward push had on the lives and lands of native peoples. This isn't just a story of expansion. It's a story of cultural collision and the enduring legacy that continues to shape communities today. Join us as we navigate this challenging but crucial chapter. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history. Hello and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into Chapter 15, the Herculean Challenges of Governance. Imagine you've just inherited a massive, sprawling estate. It's a beautiful place, rich with potential, but it's also incredibly diverse. Every corner has its own unique character, its own needs, and its own people who have lived there for generations. Now, imagine that estate is an entire nation. How do you even begin to govern a land so vast, with so many different cultures, languages, and histories, all bundled together under one flag? This isn't just a hypothetical puzzle. It was a reality for many emerging nations throughout history. The ink on the Declaration of Independence is barely dry, and suddenly, leaders are faced with a monumental task: forging a single, cohesive nation out of a patchwork of disparate regions. The central question they had to answer was enormous. How do you govern a land so large and so diverse? One of the very first and most contentious challenges was drawing lines on a map. I'm talking about borders. Where does one state end and another begin? This wasn't just about administrative convenience. It was about identity. For centuries, people had identified with their local village, their valley, or their ethnic group. National borders were often a new, and sometimes unwelcome, concept. In many cases, these new borders were drawn by colonial powers with little regard for the actual human geography on the ground. They sliced through communities, separated families, and lumped together groups who had historically been rivals. This created immediate and lasting tension. Think about it. Suddenly, your neighbor across the river, someone you've traded with your whole life, is now part of a different country. Or, you're now expected to share a government with a group you've been in conflict with for generations. These new lines on the map weren't just geographical. They were deeply political and emotional, setting the stage for future conflicts and struggles for autonomy. Beyond the external borders, there was the internal puzzle: how to organize the country into manageable states or provinces. This process was a delicate balancing act. Do you draw borders based on natural features like rivers and mountains? That seems logical, but it often ignores cultural realities. What about language? Creating states based on linguistic groups could foster a strong sense of regional identity and make administration easier, as seen in the reorganization of states in India. However, this approach also carried the risk of fueling separatism. If a state becomes too powerful and too distinct, might it one day wish to break away entirely? Then there's the economic factor. You can't create a state that's all farmland with no industrial centers, or a state that's rich in minerals but has no ports to export them. Each new administrative unit had to be economically viable. Leaders had to weigh all these factors: geography, ethnicity, language, and economics to create a system that was both functional and stable. It was a high-stakes game of political Jenga, where one wrong move could bring the whole structure tumbling down. And then, of course, there's the people. A new nation doesn't just mean new borders. It means new citizens. Governing these diverse populations was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. How do you create a shared national identity? A sense of we among people who speak different languages, practice different religions, and have completely different cultural traditions? How do you ensure that minority groups feel represented and protected, not just absorbed or ignored by the majority? This is where the concept of citizenship becomes crucial. The government had to create laws that applied equally to everyone. Regardless of their background, they needed to build national institutions, schools, a legal system, a national army that could foster a sense of unity. The goal was to persuade people to see themselves not just as members of their local tribe or region, but as citizens of a larger nation. This was a long and often difficult process of nation building. It involved creating national symbols, like a flag and an anthem, and telling a national story that everyone could see themselves in. It's a challenge that many countries are still grappling with today. To tackle these issues, different governments tried different models. Some opted for a highly centralized system, where all the power was concentrated in the capital city. The idea was to impose unity from the top down. This could be efficient, but it often alienated regional populations who felt their unique needs were being ignored. Think of a one-size-fits-all approach to governing. It rarely fits anyone perfectly. In contrast, other nations chose a federal model, granting significant autonomy to individual states. This allowed for more local control and could better accommodate regional diversity. States could have their own laws, manage their own educational systems, and celebrate their own cultures, all while remaining part of the larger nation. This federal structure acted as a safety valve, allowing regional tensions to be managed at a local level before they could threaten the entire country. However, federalism had its own risks. It required constant negotiation and compromise between the central government and the states, and there was always the danger that the balance of power could tip too far in one direction. Another critical piece of the governance puzzle was infrastructure. It's one thing to declare a unified nation on paper, but it's another thing to physically connect it. How can you govern a vast territory if you can't move troops, officials, or goods across it efficiently? This is why building roads, railways, and communication networks became a top priority for so many new governments. A new highway or railway line wasn't just a piece of engineering. It was a tool of national integration. It brought distant regions closer to the center, facilitated trade, and allowed people from different parts of the country to interact with each other for the first time. The telegraph, and later the telephone, worked in a similar way, allowing the central government to communicate its decisions and gather information from the provinces almost instantly. This physical and digital knitting together of the nation was essential for turning the abstract idea of a country into a tangible reality. Without this infrastructure, a large nation would remain just a collection of isolated islands. Finally, we have to talk about the economy. Political unity is fragile if it's not supported by economic stability. A new government had to figure out how to manage the national economy, collect taxes, and provide essential services to all its citizens. This was especially difficult in countries with vast economic disparities between regions. You might have one state that is highly industrialized and wealthy, while another is agrarian and impoverished. How do you create a national economic policy that benefits both? How do you ensure that wealth is distributed fairly, so that no region feels left behind or exploited? The government had to act as a referee and the redistributor, collecting taxes from wealthier areas and investing in infrastructure and development in poorer ones. This could create resentment, with richer regions feeling they were unfairly burdened and poorer regions feeling they weren't getting enough. Finding the right economic balance to foster growth while ensuring equity was, and still is, one of the most persistent challenges of governing a large and diverse nation. So, as we can see, the challenges of governing a large, diverse nation are immense. It's a complex tapestry woven from threads of geography, identity, politics, and economics. Drawing borders, managing diverse populations, choosing the right system of government, building infrastructure, and balancing the economy. Each of these is a monumental task in itself. Together, they represent the ultimate test of leadership and state. The solutions are never simple, and the process of nation building is never truly finished. It's a continuous process of negotiation, adaptation, and striving for a more perfect union. The choices made in these early, formative years have profound and lasting consequences, shaping the destiny of nations for centuries to come. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore these fascinating challenges. I hope this gives you a deeper appreciation for the complexities of governance. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we're diving into a truly transformative era in American history. The Great Westward Expansion. Specifically, we're unpacking Chapter 16, which explores the incredible economic promise of the West. What was it about that vast, untamed land that pulled millions of people from their homes and sent them on a challenging, often perilous journey into the unknown? The answer, in a word, was opportunity. Imagine you're living in the eastern United States in the mid-19th century. The cities are getting crowded, jobs might be scarce, and the land you've always known is already owned and developed. Then, you start hearing whispers, stories that grow into a roar, about the West, a place of wide-open spaces, fertile land, and the chance to build something entirely your own. This wasn't just a fantasy, it was a powerful economic magnet, and farming was at its very core. The Homestead Act of 1862 was a game. It basically offered 160 acres of public land to any citizen who was willing to live on it, cultivate it, and make improvements for 5 years. 160 acres. For many, this was an almost unimaginable amount of land. It represented a chance to escape the cycle of being a tenant farmer or a low-wage factory worker. It was the promise of self-sufficiency, of being your own boss, and of building a legacy for your family. The soil in places like the Great Plains was incredibly fertile, capable of producing massive harvests of wheat, corn, and other grains. This region would eventually become known as the breadbasket of the world, and it all started with a dream of a small plot of land to call one's own. Of course, it wasn't easy. The climate could be harsh and unforgiving. Settlers faced everything from blistering summers and bone-chilling winters to droughts, grasshopper plagues, and intense loneliness. They had to learn new farming techniques, like dry farming, to adapt to the semi-arid conditions. They built houses out of sod because timber was scarce, but the pull of owning property, of creating wealth from the soil with their own 2 hands, was stronger than the challenges. The economic promise was a powerful motivator that fueled their resilience and ingenuity. But the West wasn't just about farming. As more and more people moved in, new economic ecosystems began to flourish. Think about it. All those new farms needed supplies. They needed plows, seeds, tools, and household goods. This demand sparked the growth of trade and commerce. Small towns sprouted up along railroad lines, seemingly overnight. These towns became vital hubs, connecting the agricultural heartland to the industrial centers back east. The general store, the blacksmith, the saloonies weren't just scenes from a Western movie. They were the essential cogs in a new economic machine. The railroad itself was perhaps the single most important factor in unlocking the West's economic potential. Before the Transcontinental Railroad, getting goods to market was a long and difficult process. But with the Iron Horse, crops from a farm in Nebraska could be in a Chicago market in a matter of days, and from there, shipped all over the world. This integration into the national and global economy was revolutionary. Land values skyrocketed near railroad lines, and new cities like Denver, Omaha, and Kansas City boomed as centers of trade, finance, and transportation. The railroad didn't just carry crops and goods. It carried information, people, and capital, accelerating the pace of development at an astonishing rate. Beyond the farms and the railroads, there was the lure of instant wealth. The gold rush in California in 1849 was just the beginning. Subsequent discoveries of gold, silver, and copper in places like Nevada Colorado, and the Dakotas created frenzies of migration. These boom towns were wild, chaotic places, but they represented the ultimate economic gamble. While only a few struck it rich, the mining industry created a massive demand for labor, timber, food, and transportation, further stimulating the regional economy. It also drew in people from all over the world, from China, Latin America, and Europe, all chasing the same dream of a better life, adding to the diverse and dynamic culture of the West. The vast rangelands of the West also gave rise to another iconic American enterprise, the cattle industry. The era of the cowboy and the great cattle drives was a direct response to an economic opportunity. There was a huge demand for beef in the growing cities of the East, and millions of longhorn cattle roamed wild in Texas. Entrepreneurs realized they could round up these cattle and drive them north to the nearest railhead in Kansas or Nebraska, where they could be shipped to slaughterhouses in Chicago. It was a tough, dangerous job, but for a brief period, it was incredibly profitable and cemented the image of the rugged, independent cowboy in the American imagination. So, when we look back at the westward expansion, it's crucial to see it through this economic lens. It wasn't just about adventure or a vague notion of manifest destiny. It was a calculated move for millions of people seeking tangible improvement in their lives. It was the promise of land ownership for the landless, of commercial success for the aspiring merchant, of a steady wage for the laborer, and of spectacular riches for the prospector. This massive migration transformed the United States, shifting its economic and demographic center of gravity. It fueled industrialization, created vast new markets, and helped forge a national identity. Of course, this progress came at a significant cost, particularly for the Native American populations who were displaced and the environment that was irrevocably altered. We'll explore those crucial aspects in future chapters, but to understand the sheer force that drove this movement, we must first appreciate the power of the economic promise, the dream of a prosperous future waiting just over the western horizon. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this gave you a clearer picture of the economic forces that shaped the American West. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think is the most fascinating part of this story. See you next time. Welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 17, Critics and Consequences. We've just witnessed a monumental deal, one that promises to reshape the nation. But as with any grand vision, the ink was barely dry before the critics emerged from the woodwork. The air, once filled with the excitement of expansion, now crackled with political tension and pointed questions. At the forefront of this opposition were the Federalists. Remember, these are the thinkers who champion a strong, centralized federal government and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. To them, this deal wasn't just a bold move. It was a constitutional crisis in the making, a reckless gamble that threatened the very foundation of the republic they had worked so hard to build. Their first and most powerful argument was a question of authority. They scoured the Constitution, page by page, line by line, and came up empty. "Show us," they demanded. "Where does this document grant the President the power to purchase foreign land and incorporate it into the Union? Where's the clause that allows for the unilateral doubling of our country's size?" This wasn't a minor quibble. It was a fundamental challenge to the legality of the entire transaction. They argued that the President, in his enthusiasm, had overstepped his executive authority, straying into territory reserved for Congress. To the Federalists, this was a dangerous precedent. If a president could make a deal of this magnitude without explicit constitutional permission, what was to stop future leaders from making even more audacious moves? It felt like a slippery slope away from the rule of law and towards the rule of one man. This constitutional argument was more than just a legal debate. It was rooted in a deep-seated fear. The Federalists worried that this massive expansion would dilute the power of the original states, particularly their strongholds in the Northeast. They envisioned a future where their political influence would be drowned out by a wave of new, agrarian states carved out of this vast new territory. These new states, they predicted, would align with the president's party, permanently shifting the balance of power and rendering the Federalist vision for America irrelevant. One of their most vocal leaders, a prominent figure from New England, publicly declared the deal to be an act of imperial ambition. He painted a picture of a nation stretching itself too thin, becoming ungovernable and unwieldy. He questioned how a republic, founded on principles of close-knit community and shared values, could possibly maintain its character across such an enormous and diverse landscape. Could a farmer in Massachusetts truly share a common identity with a frontiersman thousands of miles away on the banks of the Mississippi? The Federalists thought not. They also raised practical, economic concerns. The price tag, while a bargain by today's standards, was a staggering sum for the young nation's treasury. How will we pay for this? De asked. Will it lead to higher taxes, to national debt, to financial instability? They saw the purchase not as an investment but as a fiscal black hole that would drain the nation's resources, diverting funds from what they considered more pressing priorities, like strengthening the Navy or building domestic infrastructure in the established states. Furthermore, the Federalists questioned the character of the land and the people being acquired. They circulated reports, some accurate and some wildly exaggerated, about the territory. They spoke of it as a vast, untamable wilderness, a howling desert unfit for civilized settlement. They also expressed deep misgivings about the diverse, non-English-speaking populations of New Orleans and the surrounding areas. How could these people, with their different laws, customs, and languages, be integrated into the American Republic? The Federalists feared a culture clash, a breakdown of social cohesion that would weaken the national fabric. Their opposition wasn't just confined to speeches in Congress or essays in newspapers. There were whispers of more radical actions. Some extreme Federalists, fearing their region was becoming a permanent minority, began to talk of secession. The idea that New England might be better off forming its own confederacy, separate from a union dominated by Southern and Western interests, started to gain traction in private conversations and secret meetings. This was the ultimate expression of their despair, a willingness to break the Union apart, to preserve their political identity. The president and his supporters, of course, had their counter-arguments ready. They framed the Federalist opposition as short-sighted, and they argued that the Constitution, as a living document, had to be interpreted with a degree of flexibility to meet the evolving needs of the nation. They pointed to the necessary and proper clause, suggesting that the power to make treaties implied the power to acquire territory as part of a treaty. This was a broad, or loose, interpretation of the Constitution, a direct contrast to the Federalists' strict constructionism. They championed the deal as a masterstroke of diplomacy and foresight, a move that secured the vital port of New Orleans, removed a powerful European neighbor from their backyard, and provided a boundless empire of liberty for future generations of American farmers. They dismissed the Federalist fears as the whining of a party losing its grip on power, unable to see the grand destiny that awaited the nation. The public debate was fierce. Newspapers became battlegrounds, with Federalist editors decrying the unconstitutional monster and Republican-lining papers celebrating the glorious acquisition. Families and friendships were strained as the country divided itself into two camps, those who saw the purchase as a betrayal of constitutional principles, and those who saw it as the fulfillment of America's manifest destiny. Despite the ferocious opposition, the tide of public opinion and political momentum was against the Federalists. The allure of cheap land and westward expansion was simply too powerful for the average American to resist. The vision of a continent-spanning republic fired the national imagination. When the treaty came before the Senate for ratification, the Federalist arguments, while constitutionally sound to many, failed to sway the majority. The deal was approved by a wide margin, but the consequences of this political battle would linger for years. The Federalists' staunch opposition painted them as an elitist, out-of-touch party, opposed to the interests of the common man and the growth of the nation. Their warnings about the dangers of unchecked executive power and their talk of secession would haunt them, ultimately contributing to their decline as a national political force. The critics had made their case, but in doing so, they had sealed their own political fate, becoming a footnote in the story of the nation's dramatic expansion. The deal was done, and the nation, for better or for worse, was now irrevocably set on a new and uncertain course. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into a pivotal moment in history. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, and do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next chapter in our story. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our journey through American history. In our last episode, we talked about the massive Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The United States just doubled in size overnight, but that raises a huge question. What happens next? You don't just buy a territory the size of Western Europe and call it a day. How do you govern it? How do its people become American citizens? Today, we're zeroing in on the jewel of that purchase, the vibrant, culturally rich region of New Orleans and telling the story of how it became the 18th state in the Union, Louisiana. So, picture this. It's the early 1800s. The area we now know as Louisiana, particularly New Orleans, is a melting pot like no other. It's not your typical American frontier town. You've got French Creoles, Spanish settlers, free people of color, Acadians or Cajuns, Germans, Irish, and of course, a significant enslaved African population. This place has its own legal system based on French and Spanish civil code, not English common law. They speak French, Spanish, and Creole far more than they speak English. So when the Americans arrive, it's a bit of a culture shock on both sides. The initial American governor, William C.C. Claiborne, had a tough job. He was only 28 years old and didn't speak French. He had to bridge this enormous cultural gap and integrate this very European-feeling territory into the very Anglo-American United States. The locals were suspicious. They cherished their traditions, their language, their Catholic faith, and their unique social structure. They worried that these new American rulers would trample all over their way of life, and honestly, they had good reason to be concerned. The Americans saw their customs as foreign and, in some cases, even backward. The first step in this process was organizing the land. In 1804, Congress divided the massive Louisiana Purchase into two parts. The vast northern part was called the District of Louisiana, and the southern part, which included New Orleans and was the most populated area, was designated the Territory of Orleans. This was the incubator for the future state of Louisiana. Now, to become a state, a territory had to go through a specific process outlined in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. First, it needed a certain population. Second, it had to write a state constitution that was approved by Congress. The territory of Orleans was growing fast. Settlers, planters, and merchants, both American and foreign, were pouring in, drawn by the fertile land and the strategic importance of the port of New Orleans. The population requirement was quickly met. By 1810, the census showed over 76,000 people living in the territory, which was more than enough to apply for statehood. But it wasn't just about numbers. There were deep political and cultural debates. The original Creole inhabitants, the ancient Louisianans, wanted to protect their culture and influence. The newly arrived Americans wanted to establish their own power structures. One of the biggest points of contention was the law. The Creoles fought fiercely to keep their civil code, and they largely succeeded. This is why, even today, Louisiana's legal system is unique in the United States, a direct legacy of its colonial past. Another major event that shaped this period was the 1811 German Coast Uprising. This was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, where hundreds of enslaved people marched from the sugar plantations along the German coast towards New Orleans, with the goal of capturing the city and ending slavery. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it sent a shockwave of fear through the white population, both Creole and American. It hardened their resolve to maintain the institution of slavery, and this issue would become a central and tragic part of Louisiana's identity as a state. Despite these tensions, the push for statehood moved forward. In 1811, Congress authorized the Territory of Orleans to hold a constitutional convention. 43 delegates, a mix of Creoles and Americans, gathered in New Orleans to draft the state's founding document. The constitution they created was quite conservative. It established a powerful governor, put property qualifications on voting and holding office, and, crucially, it enshrined the legality of slavery. It was a document designed to keep power in the hands of the wealthy, white, landowning elite. The Constitution was sent to Washington, D.C. for approval. There was some debate in Congress. Some representatives from the northern states were wary of admitting another slave state, as it would upset the delicate balance of power between free and slave states. The timing was also critical. Tensions with Great Britain were scuffed, and war was on the horizon, what would become the War of 1812. Securing the loyalty of Louisiana and the control of the Mississippi River was seen as a strategic necessity. Ultimately, the strategic importance won out. President James Madison signed the bill, and on April 30th, the territory of Orleans was officially admitted to the Union as the state of Louisiana, the 18th state. The date was chosen specifically to coincide with the 9th anniversary of the signing of the Louisiana Purchase Treaty. William C. Claiborne, the man who had overseen the entire territorial period, was elected as its first governor. Louisiana's entry into the Union was a pivotal moment. It represented the successful integration of a culturally distinct, non-English-speaking population into the American Republic. It affirmed the nation's control over the vital Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. However, it also cemented the expansion of slavery into the new Western territories, setting the stage for decades of conflict that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Just months after becoming a state, Louisiana would be thrown into the fire of the War of 1812, culminating in the famous Battle of New Orleans. But that's a story for our next chapter. The journey from a French and Spanish colony to an American state was a complex process, full of cultural clashes, political maneuvering, and deep-seated conflicts that would shape Louisiana's unique character for centuries to come. Thanks for watching. It's a fascinating and complex piece of American history, isn't it? If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Welcome back to our journey through American history. In our last chapter, we left Jefferson with a monumental deal on his hands: the Louisiana Purchase. Today, in Chapter 19, we explore the incredible, far-reaching consequences of that decision. The expansion legacy. This wasn't just about buying land. It was about buying a future, a destiny that would reshape the continent and forge the identity of a nation. Imagine it's 1803. The United States, a fledgling republic, has just doubled in size overnight. This vast, largely unknown territory stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. For the average American, it was a land of myth and promise. It was the great unknown, a canvas waiting to be painted. But this painting wouldn't be easy. The acquisition of this territory lit a fire under the American spirit, a concept that would soon have a name: Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was more than just a political slogan. It was a deeply held belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. The Louisiana Purchase was the first and most crucial step in making this belief a reality. It provided the physical space for this ambition to unfold. Suddenly, the western horizon wasn't a boundary. It was an invitation. This invitation was first answered by explorers, most famously Lewis and Clark. Their epic journey from 1804 to 1806 wasn't just an adventure, it was a reconnaissance mission. They mapped the terrain, documented its resources, and established tentative relationships with Native American tribes. Their reports, filled with tales of fertile valleys, towering mountains, and abundant wildlife, electrified the nation. The West was no longer a blank map, it was a destination filled with opportunity. And so, the people came. First, it was the fur trappers, the rugged mountain men who ventured deep into the wilderness, blazing trails that others would follow. They were the unsung pioneers, living off the land and learning its secrets. Their knowledge of the terrain was invaluable, creating the pathways for the great migrations to come. Then came the settlers. Drawn by the promise of cheap land and a new beginning, waves of families began to look westward. This is where we see the birth of one of the most iconic sagas in American history, the Oregon Trail. Starting in the 1830s, T.S. Grilling 2,000-mile journey became the primary route for pioneers heading to the Pacific Northwest. Let's pause and truly picture this. Families would sell everything they owned, pack their life's belongings into a covered wagon, and set off into the unknown. They faced incredible hardships: treacherous river crossings, blistering heat, surprise snowstorms, disease, and the constant strain of the journey itself. It was a test of human endurance and spirit. Yet, hundreds of thousands of people made this trek. Why? Because the Louisiana Territory had opened a door to a dream, the dream of owning your own piece of land, of building a life from scratch, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the Mormon Trail. These were the arteries pumping life into the new American West. Towns sprang up where there was once only prairie. St. Louis, Missouri, once a French trading post on the edge of the nation, transformed into the bustling gateway to the West, the last stop for supplies and civilization before pioneers plunged into the wilderness. This westward push, fueled by the Louisiana Purchase, had profound and often difficult consequences. The expansion inevitably brought settlers into conflict with the Native American tribes who had inhabited these lands for centuries. The concept of manifest destiny often carried a dark undercurrent, viewing the displacement of indigenous peoples as an unavoidable, even necessary, part of progress. Treaties were made and broken, and the way of life for many tribes was irrevocably altered as the tide of settlement pushed relentlessly westward. Politically, the expansion legacy of the Louisiana Purchase also intensified one of the most divisive issues in American history: slavery. With each new territory applying for statehood, the question had to be answered. Would it be a free state or a slave state? The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a direct result of this tension. It attempted to maintain a delicate balance of power in Congress by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while drawing a line across the Louisiana Territory, prohibiting slavery in the northern part. This was only a temporary solution, a bandage on a wound that would continue to fester and ultimately lead the nation towards the Civil War. So, when we look at a map of the United States today, we can see the direct legacy of 1803. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just add states like Louisiana. Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, along with significant portions of many others. It did something more fundamental. It created the physical and psychological space for the United States to become a continental power. It set the stage for the annexation of Texas, the Oregon Treaty with Britain, and the Mexican-American War, all of which further expanded the nation to the Pacific. From the first steps of Lewis and Clark to the last wagon on the Oregon Trail, the story of American expansion is inextricably linked to that single, monumental purchase. It defined the nation's character, a mix of incredible ambition, relentless optimism, rugged individualism, and a complex, often troubled, pursuit of its perceived destiny. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just a chapter in American history. It was the beginning of a whole new book. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the legacy of the Louisiana Purchase. It's a story that continues to shape the American identity to this day. If you found this journey as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button. And be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We love hearing from you, so leave your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring history. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, we arrive at Chapter 20, The Purchase that Defined a Nation. This isn't just another chapter in a history book. It's a story about a single decision, a bold and almost audacious act of diplomacy in 1803 that didn't just change the map of America, but redirected the entire current of world history. Imagine the United States in its infancy, a fledgling republic, barely 2 decades old, clinging to the Atlantic seaboard. To the west lay a vast, unknown expanse of wilderness of plains, mountains, and rivers that stretched to the horizon. This land, known as Louisiana, wasn't just empty space. It was the key to the continent, and it belonged to France, ruled by the ambitious and powerful Napoleon Bonaparte. At the time, the Mississippi River was the lifeblood of American commerce west of the Appalachians. Farmers and traders floated their goods down to the port of New Orleans, where they were loaded onto ships bound for the East Coast and the world. But access to New Orleans was precarious. It depended on the goodwill of whichever foreign power controlled it. In 1802, Spain, which had been managing the territory, suddenly revoked America's right to use the port. The American West was effectively suffocated. President Thomas Jefferson, a man who dreamed of an empire of liberty stretching across the continent, knew this was a crisis. He understood that whoever controlled New Orleans held a knife to the throat of the American economy. His initial plan was modest. He dispatched 2 envoys, James Monroe and Robert Livingston, to Paris with a clear, limited mission: purchase the city of New Orleans, and perhaps a slice of West Florida. He authorized them to offer up to $10 million. It was a strategic, defensive move to secure America's economic future. What happened next is one of history's greatest surprises. When Monroe and Livingston arrived in Paris, they found a Napoleon Bonaparte in a very different frame of mind than they expected. His dreams of a North American empire were crumbling. A massive French army sent to the Caribbean to quell a rebellion in Haiti had been decimated by disease. Without Haiti as a naval base and a source of wealth, the vast Louisiana territory became less of a strategic asset and more of an expensive liability. Furthermore, war with Britain was once again on the horizon, and Napoleon needed money. A lot of it. He knew that in a conflict with the British, defending a remote territory like Louisiana would be impossible. The Royal Navy would simply seize it. So, Napoleon made a stunning counteroffer. Why sell just the city when you can sell the entire territory? The French foreign minister, Talleyrand, casually asked the American negotiators, what would they give for all of Louisiana? All of it. All 828,000 square miles. Livingston and Monroe were floored. This was far beyond their instructions. They had no authority to make such a colossal deal. In an age without telegraphs or telephones, consulting with Jefferson would take months. A decision had to be made, and it had to be made now. In a breathtaking act of diplomatic courage, they seized the opportunity. After a few weeks of tense negotiations, they agreed on a price. $15 million. That's about 3 cents an acre. Today, that would be roughly $300 million, an absolute bargain for a landmass that would eventually constitute all or part of 15 future states. When news of the deal reached Jefferson, he was faced with a profound constitutional dilemma. Jefferson was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government only had the powers explicitly granted to it by the Constitution. And nowhere did the Constitution say a president could purchase foreign territory. He agonized over the decision. Did he have the right to single-handedly double the size of the nation? The irony was thick. The man who championed limited government was now contemplating the single most expansive use of presidential power in American history. In the end, pragmatism won out. Jefferson recognized that the opportunity was too great to pass up. The security and prosperity of the nation were at stake. He reasoned that the power to make treaties, which the president did have, could encompass the acquisition of land. He pushed the treaty through the Senate, and on April 30th, 1803, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty was signed. With the stroke of a pen, the United States of America doubled in size. The consequences were immediate and monumental. The purchase removed the threat of a major European power on America's western border, ensuring the nation's security. It opened up a vast territory for settlement and agriculture, fueling westward expansion for the next century. It guaranteed American control of the Mississippi River, solidifying the nation's economic independence. The journey of Lewis and Clark, commissioned by Jefferson to explore this new territory, would capture the nation's imagination and open a window into the incredible potential of the West. But let's reflect on the scale of this. This single purchase set the United States on a path to becoming a continental power. Without it, the story of America would be radically different. Would the United States have remained a smaller, East Coast nation, penned in by French and British territories? Would the great sagas of the American West, the pioneers, the cowboys, the gold rush have ever happened? It's hard to imagine. The Louisiana Purchase wasn't just about land. It was about vision. It was a bet on the future. It was a declaration that the United States was not destined to be a minor player on the world stage, but a nation with a continental destiny. It was a bold, risky, and constitutionally questionable move that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the nation and, by extension, the world. It was the moment a young republic truly began to understand its own immense potential. One purchase made in a moment of unexpected opportunity truly did define a nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. We'll see you in the next chapter.